The winter that strangled Warsaw in 1943 was not merely a season, but a presence, a cold intelligence that seeped through brick and bone, settling over the city with a heaviness that made sound itself feel subdued. Snow pressed against the roofs of buildings already fractured by conflict, piling into the gaps where mortar had fallen, collecting in the hollows of shattered windows, filling the craters left by shelling. The city resembled a ghost suspended in the middle of its own unfinished nightmare, its streets muffled and narrowed by the weight of occupation. There were moments when the silence was so complete that even the distant rumble of German trucks seemed softened, as if winter were trying to bury the war under its icy breath. In that suffocating stillness, four brothers moved like shadows, navigating danger with the kind of instinct born only from a childhood that had matured too early, and a fear that had grown too familiar. Their names were recorded only once, in handwriting that pressed too hard into the paper, as if the writer had wanted the letters to survive whatever came next. But in 1943 those names were spoken quietly, if at all. Alexander, the eldest, carried a solemnity that mirrored the city itself. His eyes darkened not by age, but by responsibility he never wanted. Machau, only a year younger, held the fragile hope of someone who still believed the world might return to what it had once been, though that hope had begun to thin. Yannick, restless and sharp, watched every detail with suspicious precision, as if the streets whispered things he alone could hear. And the youngest, David, barely 12, clung to his brothers with the unspoken understanding that the world beyond them held no mercy for boys like him. The four had been inseparable long before the war hollowed out their home. Now that inseparability was no longer a comfort but a necessity, a thin shield against a fate that loomed closer each day. The letter found in 2025 would speak of them indirectly, almost timidly, as though afraid to disturb the memory of what happened. It would describe the darkness that settled within the walls of their building, the tremors of fear that shook the wooden floors at night, the distant screams that drifted through the courtyards. But it would not, at least not at first, explain how four boys walked into that winter and never walked out. Their disappearance did not echo through the city. It did not spark panic or headlines or searches. In a world collapsing under the weight of countless tragedies, the vanishing of four brothers was only another quiet wound in a landscape already full of them. Yet the letter, sealed behind plaster for more than 80 years, insisted that their story mattered. It begged to be found, to be read, to be understood, as though the writer had known that the world in the future might try to forget the countless names swallowed by war. The apartment where the brothers lived had been stripped of warmth long before the Germans arrived. Their parents had vanished in the first months of occupation, pulled away in a sequence of events that no one fully witnessed and no one dared retell. Their mother left behind a shawl that still carried her scent long after she was gone. Their father left behind silence. With no adults remaining, Alexander assumed their care with a quiet ferocity, teaching them how to ration bread, how to avoid patrols, how to read danger in the faces of neighbors who had grown desperate. The city had become a labyrinth of shifting allegiances, where one wrong step might lead to imprisonment, forced labor, or worse. The brothers survived by blending into the background, slipping through alleys, delivering whispered messages for the resistance when the risk outweighed the hunger gnawing at them. On the night that would later appear in fragments within the letter, the brothers gathered around a single candle whose flame trembled whenever the wind squeezed through the cracks in the wall. Snow pressed against the window pane, as though trying to force its way inside, and the room felt colder than the streets. The candlelight cast distorted shadows over their faces, elongating their expressions into something older, something haunted. Alexander held a piece of paper he had torn from a school notebook years before, smoothing the edges as though trying to preserve a life that no longer resembled the one they had known. His handwriting had once been neat, but the war had stolen the steadiness from his hands. He wrote slowly, painfully, shaping each letter like a confession, whispering the words before he committed them to the page. He wrote because he feared what tomorrow might bring. He wrote because he believed someone in the future might need to know that they were here, that they had suffered, that they had refused to be forgotten. Outside, German voices echoed down the hallway, boots striking the floor with the sharp rhythm of authority. Yannick moved to the window and watched as shadows crossed the courtyard, their movements jagged in the moonlight. The patrols had grown more frequent in the past weeks. Rumors spread that an entire building on the next street had been emptied in a single night, its residents taken without explanation. People whispered of lists, of informants, of sudden raids that left apartments silent and doorways open like wounds. In that tension, Alexander continued writing, his breath visible in the frigid air. David leaned against him, eyes heavy with exhaustion and fear, listening to the scratch of pencil against paper, as if it were the only sound in the world that made sense anymore. At one point during that night, in the middle of that suffocating stillness, Alexander paused to ask a question he had used often to calm his brothers when fear swelled too large to hold. He asked them where they imagined they would be if all of this ended, if they could walk freely beyond Warsaw and choose a place where winter did not reign. As the brothers murmured their answers, the question hung in that fragile space between hope and despair, like a reminder that some part of them still believed in survival. And now, as you listen to their story, tell me quietly in the comments where you're watching from, as if whispering your location back through the decades, letting the brothers know that their story still reaches living ears. The candle sputtered, but did not die. Its flame reflected in the window, a trembling duplicate suspended above the snow-covered courtyard. Michał suggested they hide the letter in the wall, beneath a loose plank they discovered years before, while playing. Alexander agreed, though his hand hesitated. David watched him press the paper between the wooden boards, his small fingers brushing against the rough surface, as if afraid to let go of the last thing that bore their names. They did not seal it permanently. They assumed they would return for it when the danger passed. They imagined retrieving it together, reading the words aloud someday when the world was no longer broken. But dawn approached with a different plan. A sound jolted them awake before the sun had risen. Heavy footsteps, loud voices, an argument at the end of the hallway. Yannick, always the first to move, pressed his ear to the door. Alexander pulled David close, whispering instructions they had rehearsed countless times. Hide, stay silent, wait. But something in the air felt different this time, heavier, more urgent. The footsteps grew closer, the voices sharper. The knock on their door came not like a question, but like a verdict, a command wrapped in wood and force. Alexander's eyes widened, and in that moment, something unspoken passed between the brothers, an understanding that the script they'd practiced would not be enough. The letter, buried in the wall, remained undisturbed, as the brothers made a decision that history would fail to record. They slipped out the back exit of the building, moving with a fluidity that came from years of training themselves to vanish when necessary. Snow swallowed their footprints almost instantly, the flakes falling heavier as they darted through the alley. The world beyond the courtyard stretched into a maze of white and gray, the buildings looming like silent witnesses. They ran, guided by instinct and desperation, unaware that this would be the last time anyone saw them together. In 2025, when contractors renovating the long-abandoned building removed sections of the wall, the letter fell to the floor like a leaf releasing itself from a dead branch. The paper was yellowed and brittle, the edges curled inward as if trying to protect whatever words lay within. The handwriting, though faded, still pulsed with urgency. It spoke of fear, of silence, of a night when everything felt suspended. It hinted at something the writer could not fully name, as though the truth were too enormous and too dark to fit into a single page. The discovery of that letter would ignite questions that had slept for 82 years, questions the city itself had swallowed and buried. But before those questions can be answered, the story of that night must continue, one thread at a time, through a landscape where every shadow held a secret and every silence carried the weight of a vanished voice. And as this story descends deeper into the darkness that consumed them, I ask you to stay close, to listen carefully, and to keep their presence alive. If you feel the weight of their footsteps as you follow this tale, consider subscribing so that their journey, long hidden behind brick and dust, can continue unfolding into the light of your screen. The streets of Warsaw were not built for escape. They twisted into one another like veins, some pulsing with life, others sealed by rubble and watchmen. When the four brothers fled their building that morning, they entered a labyrinth, already breathing beneath German control, where every alley could turn into a trap, and every sound might summon the end. The city was awake in the wrong way. Doors half open, windows covered in frost, shadows crouched behind curtains, watching but never helping. The air itself felt hunted. Alexander led the way through the narrow lane behind the bakery, his boots sinking into the snow until the drifts reached his ankles. He could hear Dawid's breathing behind him, sharp, ragged, quick, as though fear had found its own rhythm in the boy's chest. They had learned to move without speaking, communicating through glances and the faintest gestures. A nod meant turn left, 2 fingers meant hide, a raised hand meant freeze. Words were dangerous, sound could betray, yet even silence betrayed them now, because the war had made silence suspicious. The brothers crossed the first courtyard and ducked behind a ruined wall where a crucifix still clung above a burned doorway, blackened by smoke, but untouched by flame. For a moment they caught their breath. Michał leaned against the brick, looking upward at the gray sky, where flakes fell thick as ash. "We can't go back," he whispered, the words forming clouds in the cold air. Alexander didn't answer. He didn't have to. They all knew it. The brothers. Small world. An apartment with peeling wallpaper, the smell of kerosene, the faint hum of the city beneath occupation, was now gone. Behind them, the building would be searched, their names perhaps written on a list, their belongings scattered. Ahead lay a city split between the living and the dying, and none of them could tell which side they would end up on. Alexander's plan, if it could be called that, was simple. Reach the other side of the river, cross toward the forest outside Praga, and find the contact who had promised shelter to resistance couriers. He had heard the name whispered in a cellar, someone who hid children, someone who smuggled messages and food through the ruins. But even that hope was only half-formed, like the faint light of dawn barely cutting through the haze. Yannick, whose eyes seemed to absorb the entire city at once, took the lead as they approached Krochmalna Street. The snow there was streaked with dark patches, mud, oil, perhaps blood. He motioned for them to stop when he spotted two soldiers farther down, their rifles slung across their shoulders as they spoke, beside a truck. Alexander pressed WWII against the wall, his hand firm against the boy's back. They waited, motionless, every second stretched into eternity. The soldiers' laughter carried in the wind, sharp and unnatural. Then, as quickly as it began, it faded. When the sound vanished, the brothers slipped through a narrow passage that smelled of rot and damp wood, emerging onto a side street where the world looked momentarily unoccupied. They weren't entirely alone, though. A figure appeared in the doorway of what used to be a tailor's shop. An older woman wrapped in layers of shawls, her eyes hollow but alert. She watched them without speaking, recognizing immediately what they were. Fugitives, ghosts still made of flesh. For an instant, she lifted her hand, pointing toward a trap door half covered by snow near the base of a wall. Alexander nodded in silent gratitude and motioned for his brothers to move. They slipped into the darkness below, one by one, the wooden lid closing above them with a muffled thud. The basement smelled of mildew and coal dust. It was cramped, lined with broken furniture and old sacks. In the corner, a small oil lamp flickered weakly, its light barely reaching the ceiling. The woman above lowered herself into the space with slow, careful steps. Her voice, when it came, was rough and quiet. "You shouldn't be here," she said in Polish, her accent thick, her eyes fixed on Alexander. "They're searching buildings again." Alexander hesitated. "We just need to reach the river. We'll be gone before night." The woman looked at him, then at the others, their thin faces, their trembling hands. "You won't make it across today," she said, shaking her head. "They've blocked the bridges. Wait until dark, then maybe." The hours that followed were a kind of waiting that felt like drowning. Every sound above them made the brothers flinch. The scrape of boots, the low murmur of voices, the clatter of something dropped on the street. The lamp sputtered. WWII huddled close to Michał, whispering questions the others couldn't answer. "Do you think she'll tell them?" he asked once, his voice barely audible. Michał squeezed his hand. "No," he said, though he didn't sound convinced. Alexander sat apart from them, watching the faint light shift as if time itself had grown uncertain. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and steady. "If we survive this day, we'll survive the rest." But survival was a word that no longer meant what it once did. Outside, the city was devouring its own, one name at a time. The woman returned at dusk, her movements hurried. "There's talk of a sweep tonight," she said. "German officers are coming through this quarter. You can't stay." She handed Alexander a small loaf of bread, wrapped in cloth, and gestured toward a back tunnel that led into the old sewer line. "Follow it until you see the second grate, then turn right. That will take you under the main street. When you climb out, you'll be close to the river." The brothers thanked her silently, though Alexander's eyes betrayed both gratitude and something heavier, fear, perhaps, or guilt at accepting help that might cost her life. Then they were moving again, descending into the darkness of the tunnel. The stench was unbearable. Stagnant water, rot, something chemical. The air was thick, heavy, unbreathable. They walked bent low, their footsteps echoing faintly against the curved brick. Rats scurried through the water ahead of them. David gagged once, but pressed on, clutching Michał's sleeve. It was there, in that endless underground silence, that Alexander began to sense something beyond the noise of war. It wasn't sound. It was an awareness, a strange pulse in the air. He couldn't explain it, only feel it, as though the city itself were breathing beneath them, alive and restless. He wondered if the tunnels remembered those who had already passed through, Jews fleeing the ghetto, partisans hiding from raids, families seeking escape. The walls seemed to hum faintly with memory, with voices too distant to make out. It was as though the city, in all its ruin, was trying to speak to them. When they reached the second grate, they stopped. Above them, faint light filtered through the metal, mingled with the sound of footsteps and distant shouting. Alexander signaled for silence. They waited until the noise passed, then turned right as instructed. The passage grew narrower, forcing them to crawl. The water here was colder, deeper. Michał slipped once, catching himself on the wall. He muttered something, perhaps a prayer, perhaps a curse. Then came the sound, faint, metallic, rhythmic. Not footsteps, but something dragging, scraping along the tunnel ahead. Alexander froze. The brothers exchanged looks, breath quickening. The noise came closer, then stopped. In that perfect, terrifying stillness, they could hear drops of water hitting stone, one by one, steady as a heartbeat. David whimpered softly, and Alexander covered his mouth gently, whispering, "Quiet." A light flickered ahead, a weak, pale glow, like the reflection of a lantern. But no one spoke, no one moved. The light wavered, shifted, then vanished. They waited another minute before moving forward again, each step slower than the last. When they reached the curve where the light had appeared, the tunnel opened into a chamber littered with old crates and debris. There was no one there. Only the faint smell of burned oil lingered in the air. Yannick knelt and touched the wet floor, his fingers coming away dark. "Someone was here," he whispered. Alexander nodded, scanning the shadows. "Then they're gone now," he said, though even as he spoke, he wasn't sure he believed it. By the time they reached the river's edge, the city had fallen into full darkness. The moon rose behind clouds, and the frozen water glimmered faintly through gaps in the ice. Across the river lay the outline of trees, the edge of the forest, freedom, perhaps, or another kind of prison. Alexander crouched low, scanning the bank. No patrols visible. For the first time that day, he allowed himself a sliver of hope. But hope is fragile when carried by those the world has already decided to erase. As they prepared to cross, David tugged his brother's sleeve and pointed toward something half buried in the snow. A boot print, deep, recent, heading in the same direction they were going. Someone else had come this way. Someone who knew the tunnels, too. They crossed, anyway. The river was half frozen, forcing them to wade through sections where the ice broke beneath their weight. The cold bit at their skin like knives. David stumbled once, nearly pulled under, but Yannick caught him. They moved together, shivering, teeth chattering, hands numb. When they reached the opposite bank, they collapsed among the reeds, breathless, shaking uncontrollably. Alexander looked back at the city they had left, the spires, the smoke, the flicker of distant fires. "We're still alive," he whispered, as though testing the truth of it. But the letter found in 2025 would later reveal that the brothers were not alone in those woods, that something or someone had followed them from the tunnels, silent and unseen. And so, as we descend further into their vanishing, keep listening. The cold will deepen, the silence will thicken, and the truth waiting in those forests will begin to breathe. If you haven't yet, subscribe so you don't lose the trail when we follow their next footsteps into the heart of the dark. The forest that greeted them on the far side of the river was unlike any place they had known. It was not a refuge, not even truly a landscape, more a living organism, pulsing with breath, sound, and silence that folded in on itself. Each tree stood as if carved from shadow, their branches heavy with ice, bending under the weight of the season. The air carried no scent, only the biting cold that stung their throats with every breath. The brothers did not speak as they entered, their movements muffled by snow and exhaustion. Behind them, the frozen river shimmered faintly in the dim light, a thin barrier separating the known horror of the city from the unknown darkness of the woods. Yet even as they stepped forward, Alexander sensed that what waited among the trees might not be any kinder than what they had fled. They moved deeper into the forest, guided by the faint outlines of old paths, half swallowed by snow. Yannick, ever watchful, scanned the ground for footprints, anything to tell them they were alone. But the drifts were smooth and unbroken. Still, the sensation of being followed did not fade. It crept beneath their skin, an awareness too subtle to name. WWII clung to Michał's coat, his steps faltering. "How much farther?" he whispered, his voice brittle from cold. Michał didn't answer immediately. He had no real answer to give. They didn't know where the contact lived. Only that somewhere beyond these woods there was supposed to be a cabin, a refuge used by couriers and children smuggled from the city. Whether it still stood, whether the man who kept it was still alive, none of them knew. By late evening, they found a clearing surrounded by skeletal birch trees. The snow here was deep but undisturbed, reflecting the pale glow of the rising moon. Alexander decided they would rest for a few hours. He gathered what dry branches he could find and lit a small fire, shielding it from view with his coat. The flame sputtered weakly, feeding on the damp wood, but it was enough to warm their hands. For a few moments the brothers huddled close, their faces illuminated by the flickering light. The forest loomed around them, vast and indifferent. It was then, as the quiet stretched, that Michał broke the silence. "Do you think anyone will find the letter?" he asked softly, staring into the fire. Alexander looked at him, his expression unreadable. "Maybe," he said, "if the building still stands." Yannick laughed under his breath, not with humor but disbelief. "If the city still stands," he murmured. The words hung there, too heavy to answer. None of them knew that 82 years later, that single page, creased, yellowed, fragile, would be pulled from the wall like a message rising from the grave. The night thickened. The forest's sounds grew stranger. The crack of ice, the low groan of branches shifting, distant movements that might have been animals or might not. Alexander couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching from beyond the circle of firelight. Each time the wind moved through the trees, he imagined footsteps just behind the sound, too deliberate, too steady. Once, he thought he saw a figure at the edge of the clearing, a darker shadow among shadows, but when he blinked, it was gone. He didn't tell the others. Fear, once spoken, had a way of multiplying. They took turns keeping watch. Yannick stayed awake long after the others drifted into uneasy sleep, his eyes fixed on the dark beyond the fire. The cold gnawed at him, biting through his thin coat, yet he refused to move closer to the flames. He thought of the tunnels beneath the city, of the strange light they had seen, the sound that had followed them. He told himself it had been nothing, Someone else escaping, another lost soul trying to survive. But deep down, something in that silence had felt wrong, as if the sound hadn't been human at all, as if it had been the echo of something older than the war itself, something that thrived on the fear of those passing through. Hours later, Alexander woke to find the fire burned low and Yannick staring into the distance. "It's still there," Yannick whispered. Alexander followed his gaze. Between the trees, where the snow met the darkness, a faint light moved slowly, like a lantern swaying in invisible hands. It glided between the trunks, stopping now and then, as though searching. Alexander's hand instinctively reached for the knife at his belt. "It's not German," Yannick said, shaking his head. "No one walks like that." The light flickered once, twice, and then vanished. By morning, the forest was silent again, almost unnaturally so. The brothers packed what little they had and continued walking east. The snow fell thicker now, blurring the horizon, turning everything into a white maze. Their world had become narrowed to breath and movement, the crunch of snow beneath boots, the rhythm of survival. Dawid, exhausted, stumbled often. Michał carried him for part of the way, though he himself could barely stand. When they finally found the cabin, it appeared almost by accident. A small structure half buried in snow, its roof sagging, smoke long since gone from the chimney. Alexander approached first, hand on his knife, heart pounding. The door hung slightly open, creaking in the wind. Inside, the air was still. Dust coated every surface, and a layer of frost glistened on the floorboards. Someone had lived here once. There were chairs, a bed, a table, but the life had drained from the place long ago. On the wall hung a coat, stiff with age. In the corner, a candle stub had melted into a pool of wax. The cabin was both a shelter and a grave, yet for the brothers it was enough. They built a fire and closed the door against the wind. Dawid curled near the heat, finally sleeping without trembling. Michał and Yannick searched the shelves for anything edible, jars, dried food, even crumbs. They found almost nothing. Alexander sat near the window, staring out into the forest. He could feel it still, the watching. Not a person, not an animal, but something unseen, something patient. That night, he dreamed of the tunnels again, the scraping sound, the flickering light, the smell of oil. But in the dream, when he turned toward the source of the light, he saw his own reflection staring back at him from the dark water, mouth moving though no sound came. When he woke, the fire was nearly dead, and the room was cold. Outside, the snow had stopped. Everything was motionless. He rose quietly and stepped outside. The forest glowed faintly under the moon, the trees standing like pale sentinels. For a moment, he thought he heard whispers, soft and distant, carried by the wind. He followed the sound a few steps into the clearing, his breath visible in the freezing air. There, half buried in snow, he saw footprints leading away from the cabin, not theirs. He crouched, brushing the snow aside. The prints were deep, uneven, as though made by something unsteady, dragging. He followed them a short distance until they disappeared into the darkness. When he turned back, the cabin looked smaller, more fragile, like it might collapse under the weight of silence. Inside, Yannick was awake, waiting. "You saw it too," he said quietly. Alexander nodded. They didn't speak further. By the following evening, their food was gone. They would have to move again. But before they left, Alexander took the scrap of paper he had saved, the second page of the letter, and wrote a few lines by the dim light of the fire. His handwriting trembled, the pencil dull. If anyone finds this, know that we reached the forest. Know that the world was not kind, but we tried to remain brothers until the end. He folded the page and slid it beneath a loose floorboard. Outside, the forest waited, dark and endless. The wind shifted, carrying with it a faint echo that none of them could explain, a sound like a whisper calling from far beyond the trees. It was not human. It was not even entirely of the world. And yet it carried something recognizable. Their names. They set out again at dawn, unaware that the cabin would later be found by scavengers, its contents long decayed, the note unreadable from damp and time. Only the original letter, the one hidden in the wall, would survive, a fragment of everything they had been. The forest swallowed them whole, their footsteps fading into the snow. And so the question that lingered through the decades was not simply where they went, but what they became. Because when the letter was discovered in 2025, experts claimed the paper bore fingerprints, 4 distinct sets, faint but preserved. Yet all 4 belonged to the same genetic sequence, as though the brothers, somehow, had become one. If you've followed the brothers this far into the dark, you can feel how close we are to the truth. But the next step leads even deeper, into what was waiting for them beneath the trees, and what the letter's final torn paragraph tried to reveal before time sealed it away. Stay with me. Subscribe, if you haven't yet, so you don't lose the trail when we follow them into the heart of disappearance itself. By the time the brothers reached the heart of the forest, days had blurred into something that no longer resembled time. The world beyond the trees, the city, the river, even the war itself, had receded into a dream that no longer obeyed ordinary chronology. Their footprints disappeared almost as soon as they made them, erased by drifting snow. Alexander could no longer tell if they had been walking for hours or for lifetimes. The forest around them was so dense that light itself seemed to falter, as if every ray of sun that entered was devoured by the branches before it could reach the ground. They had stopped eating 2 days earlier, when the last of the bread turned to mold. But hunger had ceased to feel like pain. It had become a strange clarity instead, a numb lucidity that made their movements slow but precise. Michał hummed to himself as they walked, the sound low and toneless, a melody that was less a song than a way of keeping the silence from consuming them. Dawid still followed close to his brothers, though his eyes had taken on a vacant sheen. His lips were pale, and he spoke less with each hour. Alexander knew that if they didn't find shelter soon, Dawid would not survive another night. As the light faded, they came upon what looked like the remains of a settlement, a cluster of wooden structures leaning into each other as though trying not to fall. The roofs were caved in, the doors hanging from rusted hinges. Alexander hesitated before stepping inside the largest of the huts. The air was thick with dust and the smell of decay. He could see remnants of a hearth, broken furniture, and what might once have been a bed. The walls were scratched with markings, crude, almost desperate lines carved into the wood, repeating symbols over and over again. Some looked like letters, others like something older, a pattern beyond words. Michał ran his hand over the carvings, tracing the grooves with his fingertips. "Someone lived here," he said quietly. Alexander nodded, though the truth was less comforting than it sounded. Someone had lived here, yes, but not recently. The sense of abandonment hung heavy, as if whatever had driven the previous inhabitants away still lingered unseen. Janek crouched by the doorway, scanning the snow. No new tracks, he murmured. No animals either. The forest had gone unnaturally still again, as though even life itself avoided this place. They decided to stay the night. The hut offered little warmth, but at least it provided walls to keep out the wind. WWII collapsed near the hearth, his face colorless. Michał wrapped his coat around the boy and rubbed his arms, whispering reassurances neither of them believed. Alexander searched for anything useful and found, half buried under debris, a metal box. Inside were fragments of paper. Brittle, discolored, covered in handwriting too faded to read. He could make out only a few words: night, light, voices beneath the trees. The ink had bled into the paper, blurring everything into a kind of ghostly map of thought. As darkness settled, Janek built a small fire. Its glow flickered against the walls, illuminating the strange carvings again. Now, in the dancing light, Alexander realized something. Some of the symbols repeated in groups of 4. 4 vertical lines crossed by a 5th. 4 circles joined by a single line. 4. Always 4. His stomach tightened. "Do you see this?" he asked. Michał looked up, eyes heavy with fatigue. "What does it mean?" Alexander didn't answer. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind shifted direction, carrying a sound faint but distinct. A low hum, almost like singing, though no human voice could have made it. It came and went, threading through the trees like a current. WWII stirred, whispering something in his sleep. Alexander leaned closer, straining to hear. The boy's lips moved soundlessly for a moment before he exhaled a single word. "Home." Later, when the fire died and they sat in darkness, Alexander thought about that word. Home had once meant warmth, laughter, the smell of bread. Now it meant nothing but a memory half erased. He wondered if perhaps WWII, in his fevered state, had glimpsed something the others couldn't. The ghost of the place they had lost. Sometime in the night, Alexander woke to find the door of the hut standing open. The cold rushed in like a living thing. He sat up quickly, scanning the shadows. The others were still there. Michał curled around WWII, Janek asleep near the wall. Alexander rose silently, moving toward the door. The snow outside reflected just enough moonlight to see by. He stepped into the clearing and froze. Footprints, a trail of them leading from the doorway into the forest. But the prints were wrong, uneven, elongated, as if whatever had made them was dragging itself forward. They weren't the boots of soldiers nor the paws of animals. They were human in shape, but distorted, stretched as though belonging to something caught between worlds. Alexander followed them a few steps before stopping. He could feel the same presence he had sensed since leaving the tunnels, watching from somewhere beyond sight. The trees swayed though there was no wind. A whisper rose around him, faint at first, then clearer, though it did not come from any direction he could name. It sounded like voices layered over one another, speaking in unison. The words were indistinct, but one phrase seemed to repeat: "Stay together." When Alexander turned back toward the hut, he saw movement at the window, a flash of light, like a reflection or a flame. He hurried inside. Janek was awake now, staring at the wall where the carvings shimmered faintly in the dimness. "They're changing," he said. Alexander looked closer and saw that he was right. The grooves in the wood seemed deeper, darker, as though freshly cut. He reached out to touch them, but the moment his fingers brushed the surface, a shiver ran through the air, and the firewood in the hearth cracked violently, sending sparks upward. WWII cried out in his sleep. The sound broke whatever tension had filled the room, and suddenly everything was still again. The markings were just markings. The silence returned, but none of them slept after that. When dawn came, it was gray and weak. Alexander insisted they leave. None argued. The forest seemed to close around them as they walked, the trees growing thicker, their trunks black with frost. Every direction looked the same. By midday, they realized they were lost. It was then that they found the pit. At first it appeared as a depression in the snow, but as they drew closer, the ground sloped sharply downward into a hollow where the trees gave way to open air. The pit was wide and perfectly circular, as though carved deliberately. At its center, buried beneath a thin crust of ice, was something metallic, the curved edge of what looked like a door, though it led nowhere. Michał crouched at the rim, brushing snow aside. "What is this?" he asked. No one answered. Alexander knelt beside him and touched the metal. It was cold, colder than the air, and vibrated faintly beneath his hand. There were symbols etched into the surface, the same 4 lines, the same intersecting marks. His pulse quickened. "It's the same," he murmured. The wind rose suddenly, swirling the snow into a vortex that stung their faces. WWII clutched Michał's arm, terrified. Then from somewhere deep beneath the ground came a sound, not loud, but low and resonant, like the echo of a faraway bell. It lasted only a moment, but it left the forest silent in its wake. Alexander stood slowly, looking at each of his brothers in turn. "We leave now," he said, but when he turned toward the path they had come from, there was nothing there. No tracks, no trail, only endless white. The forest had swallowed the way back. That night, they camped near the pit, too exhausted to move farther. None of them spoke of what they had seen, though the memory of that vibrating metal haunted each of them differently. WWII whispered again in his sleep, his words strange and jumbled. "It's calling," he murmured. "It's calling our names." When Alexander tried to wake him, the boy's eyes snapped open, but they were unfocused, reflecting the faint moonlight like glass. "We're already there," WWII said softly. "We never left the city." Alexander froze. "What did you say?" But WWII only blinked, confused, as though waking from a nightmare he couldn't remember. Later, long after the fire died, Alexander sat awake, listening to the wind move through the trees. The hum returned, low, steady, almost melodic. He realized with horror that it matched the rhythm of their breathing. The forest was breathing with them, and though they could not know it, the letter, the one hidden behind the wall in 1943, would contain a single unfinished line near the bottom, one that researchers in 2025 would struggle to decipher. The ink had bled, but the words were almost clear. "The forest is not where we went missing. It is where we began. If you are still following their footsteps, still hearing that hum in your own chest as you listen, stay close. The next descent will take us to the place where truth and disappearance become the same thing. And if you haven't yet, subscribe, because what comes next is the moment the brothers step beyond everything human." The 5th night in the forest arrived without stars, only the slow accumulation of cloud and the hiss of unseen wind through the branches. The snow had frozen into a thin crust that broke beneath each step, a sound that echoed too loudly in the stillness. Alexander could feel that the forest was changing, not visibly, not in the way trees shift or snow melts, but in its pulse, in the way the silence moved. The air no longer felt natural. It seemed to listen, to memorize. He began to sense that the brothers were not simply lost in the forest. They were inside something, enclosed by it, studied by it. The pit they had found the day before remained near their camp, a black mouth hidden beneath ice. Alexander avoided looking at it, though he knew Yannick had gone back twice during the night, unable to resist its pull. Each time he returned, his eyes seemed more distant, his words shorter. When Alexander asked what he'd seen, Yannick only said, "It's not deep, it's endless." Then he'd gone quiet again. The morning brought no sunlight, only the gray blur of a horizon that refused to form. They walked east, or what they thought was east, but every direction led back toward the pit. Alexander marked the trees with a knife. Small cuts along the bark, but when they circled back an hour later, the marks were gone. Either the forest healed itself, or it never kept still long enough for his memory to matter. David was growing weaker, his lips cracked, his eyes sunken. Michał carried him on his back, whispering songs in Polish, soft and broken. Alexander's own thoughts had begun to fray, pieces of memory blending with the present. Sometimes he thought he could hear church bells from the city, though the sound faded when he tried to focus on it. By dusk, they returned, inevitably, to the pit. The wind had uncovered more of the metal surface, revealing a ring of symbols etched around the edge, shapes that resembled letters, though not from any alphabet Alexander recognized. They pulsed faintly with frost, light flickering beneath the ice. "It's glowing," Michał said, his voice trembling. Alexander crouched beside the rim, feeling the vibration again through the snow. It was stronger now, rhythmic, almost like breathing. "It's alive," Yannick whispered. No one disagreed. They built a fire a few meters away and sat in silence. Alexander pulled out the last of their paper, the third and final sheet from the notebook, and began to write. Again, his hand stiff from cold. He described the forest, the pit, the sound beneath the ground. He wrote not for survival now, but for witness, as though documenting the proof of something that should not exist. He didn't know who might ever read it, but part of him hoped that if someone found these pages, they would understand that the war's horrors were not the only ones haunting the earth. The night deepened, and with it, the vibration grew louder. The fire dimmed, though Alexander fed it wood. The air thickened, and the cold took on an almost physical weight. David stirred restlessly, whispering again in his sleep. This time his words were clear. "They're here," he murmured. "They've been here all along." Yannick stood abruptly and moved toward the pit. "Don't," Alexander warned, but Yannick didn't stop. He knelt at the edge, peering into the dark. The ice covering the center had begun to crack, lines spreading outward like veins. "It's calling," Yannick said. "Can't you hear it?" And now Alexander could. A low, resonant hum that rose and fell in perfect cadence with his heartbeat. It wasn't sound anymore. It was pressure, like the forest itself was exhaling beneath their feet. The ice split open with a sharp, ringing crack. The fire flickered violently, as if recoiling from the noise. A plume of cold mist rose from the pit, and beneath it, Alexander thought he saw movement. Shapes shifting in the darkness below, not human, but not entirely alien either. For a heartbeat, he imagined faces, 4 of them, looking back up at him. Then David screamed. The sound broke through everything, the hum, the wind, the stillness. Alexander ran to him, finding the boy pointing toward the pit, his eyes wide with terror. "It's us," David whispered. "They're us." Alexander turned. The mist thickened, swirling with impossible light. He saw silhouettes rising slowly, their outlines wavering like reflections in water. And yes, they were four. 4 figures emerging from the dark, matching the brothers' heights, their movements synchronized, deliberate. Alexander felt the world tilt. The air seemed to fold inward, collapsing distance, bending light. Michał stumbled backward, pulling David into his arms. Janek stood frozen, trembling. "They're mirrors," he said, "or ghosts." The figures did not speak, but the hum deepened, vibrating through the ground, through bone. Alexander felt it behind his eyes, inside his chest. He dropped to his knees, clutching his head. The world dissolved into sound and light, and in that moment he understood, not with words but with something deeper, that the forest was not a place at all. It was an echo. The war had filled Warsaw with too much death, too much grief. The walls, the tunnels, the streets, all of it had absorbed pain beyond measure. The forest was its reflection, the shape grief took when the world could no longer contain it. And somehow, the brothers had crossed into that reflection. The pit was the threshold. The light faded slowly, leaving only the sound of their own breathing. The figures were gone. The pit was still. But something had changed. Alexander looked at his brothers, really looked, and saw it in their eyes. David's pupils were too wide, swallowing the color. Michał's skin had taken on a faint luminescence, a glow that pulsed in time with the dying hum. Janek was silent, his gaze unfocused, fixed on something beyond sight. They stayed near the fire until dawn, no one speaking. Alexander didn't write again. There was nothing left to say. The next morning they began walking once more, though none of them knew where they were going. The forest no longer followed geography. The trees changed shape. The light came from nowhere. They walked for what felt like hours before finding a narrow stream winding through the snow. David knelt beside it to drink, but when he touched the surface, the water rippled strangely, not outward, but inward, as though pulling him. He jerked his hand back. Alexander knelt beside him and touched the stream himself. For a second, he saw something reflected there. The city of Warsaw, but twisted, inverted, its streets flooded with shadow, its people moving like echoes trapped between seconds. He stumbled backward, gasping. The stream settled into stillness, reflecting only the pale light of the sky. That night, they camped beside the stream. The sound of running water seemed almost human now, whispering indistinct phrases. Michał slept fitfully, his body twitching. Alexander stayed awake, his thoughts unraveling into fragments. He could no longer tell if what they were seeing was real or a fevered hallucination. But one truth gnawed at him, the feeling that their disappearance had already happened, that they were only walking through the echo of their own vanishing. In 2025, forensic analysis of the letter would reveal faint marks on the back of the final page, indentations from pressure, as though another message had once been written there and erased. Specialists would reconstruct only fragments of it. The last line they could read was this: "The snow remembers the shape of our footsteps, even after we have become the wind." Alexander looked at his brothers one last time that night. Their faces illuminated by the fire, their breath mingling in the cold air. He thought of their mother's shawl, of the small apartment they once called home, of the laughter that now felt like someone else's memory. He thought of the letter hidden in the wall, waiting for a future that might never come, and he realized something terrible and beautiful at once. They were no longer meant to survive. They were meant to be remembered. So when the light began to glow again from the direction of the pit, rising and pulsing like a heartbeat beneath the snow. Alexander didn't wake the others. He stood and walked toward it, one step at a time, the forest opening before him like a mouth. The hum welcomed him home. If you're still here, listening, breathing with them in the dark, press the like button, not as habit but as a signal, a pulse in the algorithmic night, telling the brothers their story has reached you, because they are not gone. Not yet. And when we move into the final chapter, you'll understand why their letter waited 82 years to be found. When the forest opened, it did so, not as a clearing, but as a void, a space without depth, where sound seemed to fold inward and light dimmed into a gray without source. Alexander stepped into it first, his boots sinking slightly into snow that wasn't snow at all, but a fine white dust that clung to his skin and clothes like ash. Behind him, the faint outline of the others moved slowly through the haze. The pit was gone now, or rather it had spread, swallowing the ground around it, until the world itself seemed to exist on its rim. No birds sang, no branches cracked. The silence was total, a silence that didn't rest on top of sound, but devoured it completely. Alexander's breath formed faint clouds in the frozen air, though he no longer felt cold. He looked back at his brothers. Michał's face hollowed by exhaustion, Janek's eyes unfocused, David's small frame trembling as though from fever. And for the first time since they'd left Warsaw, he realized they no longer cast shadows. The firelight from their last camp should have followed them, yet here the light found no surface to rest on. It simply dissolved. They moved forward because there was no other direction left to take. Step by step, they walked until the whiteness thinned, revealing something vast and impossible rising before them. Structures of ice, shaped like towers, but not built by any human hand. Their surfaces glowed faintly from within, like veins lit by trapped moonlight. Each tower bore the same markings Alexander had seen on the pit, the repeating pattern of 4 lines crossed by a 5th. As they approached, he could hear the hum again, deep and steady, echoing inside the frozen pillars. Dawid reached out a hand, touching one of the symbols carved into the ice. The glow intensified for an instant, and Alexander thought he heard whispers, thousands of them, threads of voices speaking in languages that had never existed. The sound wasn't frightening. It was tender, almost sorrowful, like a collective memory mourning itself. The ice vibrated under Dawid's fingers, and he pulled back, startled. "It's remembering us," Michał said quietly. Alexander frowned. "What do you mean?" Michał pointed toward the tower, where now, faintly visible beneath the translucent surface, were 4 human figures. Silhouettes, frozen mid-step. Alexander stepped closer. The forms were distorted but unmistakable. One carried a smaller figure on his back. One turned his head as if calling to the others. One walked ahead, hand extended as though guiding them forward, and the last trailed behind, smallest of all, head bowed. It was them. The realization hit with physical force. Alexander stumbled backward, his pulse racing. The ice shifted, groaning softly, and new shapes began to appear within. Faces, hands, echoes of others who had passed through before them. Dozens, perhaps hundreds, all frozen mid-motion, caught between worlds. The hum deepened, vibrating through the ground. Janek covered his ears, shouting something that was swallowed by the silence. Then the world began to breathe again, not with air, but with light. It rippled through the towers, rising and falling like the rhythm of lungs. The ground beneath their feet pulsed, the white dust lifting slightly with each beat. Alexander understood then that they were standing on something alive, or more precisely, something that had once been alive and now remembered how to live through them. He turned to his brothers, shouting above the invisible sound, "We need to leave." But the words meant nothing now. Dawid was staring upward, his eyes wide, his mouth open in awe. "It's beautiful," he whispered. "Can't you see them?" Alexander followed his gaze. Above them, where the haze met the edge of the forest, the air shimmered with faint figures, luminous shapes, rising and falling like breath. They were human, but not solid, made of light and shadow. For a moment, Alexander saw his parents among them, standing hand in hand, their faces calm, their eyes reflecting the same impossible light. He wanted to call out, but his voice caught in his throat. Michał took a step forward. "Maybe this is what comes after," he said softly. "Maybe this is what the letter was for." Alexander shook his head. No, the letter was meant for the living. But as he said it, he felt the truth unravel beneath his words. The letter was not a message to the future. It was a tether, a way to hold their memory in the physical world while the rest of them crossed into something else. The letter had been written not to tell their story, but to anchor it, to keep one part of them behind so that the other could disappear completely. The light grew stronger, cascading through the ice until everything shone with blinding brilliance. The hum became almost melodic now, a resonance that seemed to come from within their bodies rather than around them. Dawid stepped forward first, his small figure illuminated. Alexander reached out instinctively to pull him back, but his hand passed through nothing but air. Dawid was still there, yet not solid anymore, his outline dissolving into motes of light that drifted upward, merging with the luminous figures above. Michał followed next, his face serene. Yannick resisted, taking a step back, shaking his head violently. "We can't just—" he began, but the words broke apart, scattering like dust in wind. Alexander was left standing alone. The towers of ice shone brighter, and the hum reached its peak. A sound that was neither harmony nor chaos, but something vast enough to contain both. He could feel himself fading at the edges, his body unraveling into particles that shimmered with warmth. He thought of the apartment walls in Warsaw, of the candlelight trembling against cracked plaster, of his handwriting pressed hard into paper. He thought of the future, of hands uncovering the letter, of voices reading the words aloud, of the world remembering what the forest had taken. He smiled faintly. "So this is what we became," he whispered. "Not gone, just written differently." Then the light consumed everything. For decades, the forest remained untouched, frozen in time. Locals whispered about it, how compasses spun uselessly near its borders, how animals avoided the snow-covered paths. After the war, maps stopped marking it altogether. It became an absence on paper, an omission in geography. But beneath the roots, beneath the ice, something pulsed quietly, waiting. In 2025, when construction workers began renovation on an old tenement near Warsaw's riverbank, they uncovered a wall that sounded hollow. Behind it, wrapped in layers of plaster and dust, they found the letter. The paper had aged to the color of bone. The ink faded to gray, yet the words remained legible. It was dated February 1943. At first, historians assumed it to be one of many wartime testimonies, another fragment of a city that had learned to bury its pain. But as they read, they noticed details that didn't fit. descriptions of the forest east of the river that no one could identify, passages that referred to lights beneath the ground, to echoes that remembered names. The letter ended abruptly, its final lines trailing off mid-sentence. If we are found, do not mourn. The city remembers through us. The snow will hold our shapes until someone reads these words aloud, and we are allowed to breathe again. When the restoration team finished their work, strange things began to happen inside the building. The walls seemed to hum faintly at night. Plaster dust drifted upward rather than settling. Once, a worker swore he heard 4 voices murmuring in unison from behind the walls. He quit the next day. Months later, researchers conducted spectral analysis on the letter. They discovered that beneath the visible ink, a second layer of graphite traces existed. Words written, then erased. Advanced imaging recovered fragments. The last decipherable sentence read, "The door beneath the snow is opening again." The building was sealed for study shortly after. And so, the story of the 4 brothers remains neither legend nor fact, suspended somewhere between. Historians call it coincidence, the echo of trauma, the psychological residue of a city that endured too much. But those who visit the ruins at the forest's edge still claim that on winter nights, when the air turns brittle and the world falls silent, they can hear the faint hum rising from beneath the frozen ground. Some say it's the sound of wind moving through the trees. Others swear it's breathing. If you have followed their journey this far, through war, snow, and silence, if you felt the pull of that hum even for a moment, know that you too have entered the echo. The story survives because you listened. The brothers are remembered because you remained. So now, before you leave, press like as if lighting a candle in the ruins. Subscribe to keep this story alive, to keep their names spoken, to remind the forgotten that their disappearance was not an ending, but a transformation. The letter is no longer sealed in the wall. It lives now in every voice that dares to read it aloud. And when the snow falls again over Warsaw, perhaps you'll listen closely enough to hear 4 sets of footsteps returning.